Welcome to the Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to tell you about some exciting news. We're now working with the Great Courses to bring you a special offer for the Great Courses Plus. It's an app you have on your phone, and you can download courses or individual lectures from any number of hundreds of courses like this one here I just started listening to. And as most of you know, I've been tweeting and posting on social media for years the different courses I've been taking from the Great Courses. And now I'm doing the Great Courses Plus, in which you can access individual lectures from any number of courses. For example, Patrick Grimm's The Philosopher's Toolkit was one I recently listened to. Professor Richard Spence's The Real History of Secret Societies. Another one was Daniel Breyer's Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature, all super interesting. And this one, The Rise of Communism, some really good history here. And you can skip around. That's the beauty of this. You don't have to take the entire course or buy one course. You can just subscribe and access hundreds of courses or just individual lectures from any one of those hundreds of courses. They're 30-minute lectures. You can listen to them at higher speeds if you want, so they're only 20 or 25-minute lectures each. I usually consume a couple of lectures a day when I'm cycling, hiking, doing chores, driving, whatever. It's a great way to consume content when you're just multitasking. So for limited time only, they're offering my listeners to the podcast here an entire month for free. So to do that, access it online at thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks. My guest today is Bobby Duffy. His new book is Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, A Theory of Human Misunderstanding. Bobby is the director of the Policy Institute and professor of public policy at King's College London. Formerly, he was managing director of Ipsos Mori Social Research Institute and global director of the Ipsos Social Research Institute. He lives in London. So it was late in the afternoon for him, early morning for me. Great book, really interesting conversation about all the things that we get wrong, mostly socially, culturally, politically, about other people is kind of his focus. He's a big data analyst, so he tries to tease out of the data and through interesting experiments what people are really thinking and perceiving and misperceiving. So we cover a lot of the hot button topics: immigration, artificial intelligence, religion, and politics, Trump, Brexit, all the things, anti-vaccination, all the things that people think they have an accurate opinion of, but they're wrong about, but their beliefs are what drive them to act, like vote. So we talk about the backfire effect and how best we can change people's minds, correct their mistaken facts, and so on. Anyway, if you enjoy this podcast, as usual, we appreciate your support at skeptic.com/donate or through Patreon. You can send checks or credit cards online. You can email us or mail us. And as always, we appreciate the support. That's what fuels the podcast and the rest of the Skeptic Society. So thank you for listening. Bobby Duffy, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. And your new book is Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything, A Theory of Human Misunderstanding. I'm glad you said about nearly. Obviously we can't be wrong about everything, or else we wouldn't have gotten to the moon and cured communicable diseases and all the wonderful things we've done in modern civilization. So you're talking about something else.
Yeah, that's right. I'm talking about how often we're miles out on when we try to estimate social and political realities. We get them very wrong. So on all sorts of things, from immigration levels to what percentage of people have had teenage girls have had babies in the last year. Incredibly we're often overestimating things because we're worrying about them. So taking that teenage pregnancy as an example, the average guess in the US is that 24% of women and girls aged 15 to 19 in the US give birth each year. So a quarter of all teenage girls giving birth each year, when it's only actually 2%. So massive overestimation. When you think about it for a little while, even a short amount of time, the idea that 1 in 4 teenage girls are going to be giving birth each year. So you're going to have, in an old girl class of 30, you're going to have 7 or 8 girls giving birth every single year. So 7 or 8 baby showers every single year in these classes. So it shows kind of when we're estimating things, there's much more going on than just trying to get the right answer.
Yeah, before we get into all that, because you have so many interesting examples in the book, how did you get into this? You open your book with the story of sitting in a psych class and kind of bemoaning the way the profs are dressed and how cool they seemed and all that.
Yeah, no, I was quite resentful of the kind of social psychology classes, and how we all seemed deeply predictable, deeply flawed, and very predictable in the ways that we're flawed. So you would have all those tests. If you've done psych classes, you would have done those tests where it looks like you're answering one question, but really the professor has got some cunning plan underneath where he's testing you on something else, and you kind of fall into the traps quite a lot of the time. And I kind of resented that, and I kind of, looking back now, I realize actually I shouldn't have been resentful of that in many ways, because it taught you a lot about how people think in reality. And it's kind of, I suppose the thing that prompted me, first of all, to look at misperceptions specifically, we did a study in the UK where asking people about perceptions of crime, whether it was going up or down. This was during the Tony Blair government years. Mm-hmm. And they'd invested an awful lot in the police, and crime rates were going down, but no one recognized that. No one saw that. And then, so it immediately raised a couple of questions for me about, is it just crime that people are wrong on, or are there other issues that people get wrong? And is it just the UK that's uniquely wrong in these types of perceptions? Are we uniquely dumb, or does it happen all around the world? And I kind of, so that prompted a whole series of studies looking at different issues in different countries. And we ended up with 100,000 interviews done across 100 issues in 40 countries in the end. So we kind of built up a big database of where we're wrong and why.
So you're a big data guy. Your background, so you ended up staying in the social sciences, but moving away from the deceptive social psych experiments into more massive data sets.
That's right. I mean, so I'm a survey researcher by background. I did survey methods and then social policy. So it was kind of, my interest is in what people think and how they think. And it's those connections between the two that I brought together in the book, I guess, because that's actually understanding what people think through surveys is limited. You can't get into everything, but it's the best way we have still of getting a representative view of what the general public across different countries think. So huge value in learning that. When it's used sensitively, I think you can misinterpret polls and surveys very easily. You need to combine that with an understanding of how people think, not just what they report in surveys.
Yeah, so much of the social psychology we're talking about depends on deceiving the subjects, because if they knew what they were doing, they wouldn't do it. So there was a story the other day about Stanley Milgram's famous shock experiments, and the claim by the scholar who studied the unpublished notes was that a lot of the subjects could see what was going on, and they knew that the subject probably wasn't really being electrocuted, or if they were, it was somehow not really going to kill them. And therefore, what was he really studying? Obedience to authority or some kind of role playing for the experiment?
Yeah. And I saw your tweets about that. It's a really interesting case study. I think it's all of those types of things. The thing that I'm really keen to emphasize in the book is that quite often the psychological experiments, social psychology and the psychological experiments look so striking to us. We find out something that really draws our attention about people act in a particular way in this circumstance, and so that's tested and it's a very rigorous design. But because it's so striking, we kind of fall foul to one of our biases, which is we then think that applies to everyone in all situations, and that we end up in this kind of, I kind of worry about us ending up in the view that we're all automatons driven by our biases and heuristics, when actually it's much more complex and mixed than that. And I think this is not the fault of great social psychology and psychology experimenters. it's not them interpreting it like that. It's kind of when it gets into the public realm and gets written up in the media, it quite often comes across as this is a violent effect that is just applies to everyone. And it's kind of that worries me, because it's what I see in a lot of my work interacting with the public is we're not automatons. We've got a lot of nuance in our thinking in reality, and people change their views. It's not, and particularly in today's sort of climate, this idea that we're all polarized and stuck entirely in our filter bubbles. We have to be careful. These are important issues, but we have to be careful not to encourage people to think it's all set and we should just give up. We're all.
But you still have to kind of tease the data out, like in your discussion on how much sex people have. If you just ask people how much sex do you have, either they're misremembering or they're exaggerating, or they're exaggerating downward under social pressure. So you have to kind of work around that to try to get what people are really thinking. Like you have a nice blurb from Seth Stevens-Davidovitz in his book Everybody Lies, which I read. It was great. And if you ask people how many times have you searched on Google N-word jokes, of course people go, no. The answer is going to be 0. No one's going to say that they do that. But then if you actually look for their searches, in fact, they're lying. They do this, and they do it in some places more than others, like southern states versus northern states and whatnot. So in a way, that's kind of what you're doing in this sort of meta analysis of asking people not just how often do you think people are having sex or whatever, but how often do you think other people think they're having sex and so on. And from there, you can kind of tease out what people are really thinking. So walk us through some of those examples. You start with, can you see the Great Wall of China from space, and some of these kind of fun examples, and then we can get into some of the more serious stuff. How do we distort or deceive, and what's the difference between ignorance and delusion?
Yeah. So, if we want to start with the Great Wall of China, the reason I start with that is I think it illustrates. I ask this when I do it with audiences. I ask them to put their hands up if they think it is, and what you find is usually in the audiences that come to these types of things, it's about 30-40% of people that will say, yes, it is visible from outer space. And that's kind of much in line with the general public. It's been asked lots of times around the world, and it's about 50% of people generally think it is. And it's a trivial question, but it illustrates some of the issues, I think, that underlie it. So first of all, it's in a Kahneman sense of fast thinking. People are not really putting a lot of attention to this. It's quite a trivial question. Then there's an element of humans struggle with scales, the scale of things. We mix up scales quite readily. So the Great Wall of China is extremely big. In fact, it is one of the largest man-made structures on Earth, but it's its length that gives it that scale. And that doesn't make it visible from outer space. You get a very long thing, but at its widest, it's only the same size as a medium-sized house. So it's not it's not a property that will make it visible from outer space. And then third, there is illusory truth bias, in terms of, if we're talking about the biases that we submit to in these types of things, is that we've heard it. It was a Trivial Pursuit board game answer for many, many years, only recently corrected in that it was in Chinese textbooks. I think it may still be in Chinese textbooks. You probably didn't see it in Chinese textbooks, but some people. So it's kind of lots of great experiments that show when you repeat a lie or false information, people are more likely to believe it the second and third time, because it's related to a sense we have in our brain of fluency, that if it comes readily as a recollection, we believe it to be true. So there is an element of that. The fourth reason is really important to the book and the kind of themes on this more serious issues, is it's also more emotional than we think, these types of facts. It's kind of interesting. It's like an impressive fact that we could build as humans. We can build something that's visible from outer space. We're actually probably more attached to it than we realize. It's kind of more interesting, more impressive than we think. And then the fifth one, I usually ask people, do you believe me? The people who put their hands up, do you believe me? Now that I've told you it's not visible from outer space, and everyone mostly nods and says, yeah, sure, I believe it. Which is a very light touch example of how people change their mind. They do take on new information. We're not completely set in our views, which is really important to bear in mind. Again, talking about that polarization point. So I think, that relates into the point about misperception or delusion versus a lack of knowledge or ignorance. This is not a series of trivial pursuit questions. We're not testing knowledge. We're testing positively held beliefs in false views of the world. So that's what the distinction. Ignorance is kind of like an absence of knowledge. Misperceptions are all about, actually, I believe this to be true, even when it's not. That's a really important point. It kind of points to the conclusion. This is not about filling people up with more knowledge. This is about this is not about simplistic myth busting or correcting people. This is about sometimes issues that are deeply embedded within people's identity, and it takes a lot to shift those types of issues.
Yeah, I think was it Mark Twain who said it's not what people don't know that's the problem, it's what they think they know that's wrong.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. And that is the problem. That is the problem. And that's what we look at. That's what I look at quite a lot in the book, is those types of things.
Yeah, and so starting off with the Great Wall of China from space issue, no one really has an emotional commitment to that. It's not like it's part of my politics or my religion. But if I'm a conservative and I'm worried about immigration, particularly Muslims or Mexicans, where I am in California, and you tell me I've exaggerated tenfold the amount of immigration, I'm less likely to readjust my facts, right?
That's right. So we did ask exactly that. So in America, 14% of the population are immigrants, around that kind of number. Even if you added illegal immigration or uncounted immigration, it won't make much difference to the percentage. It's a percentage point here or two here or there. But the average guess is 33%.
Wow.
So more than twice the level. So we did actually go back to people who said, and that's the average. These are the averages. So people who said 33% or more, we went back to them and said, actually, your official statistics for your country, we did this in lots of countries, official statistics in your country says it's actually just 14%. Why do you think it's so much more? And the top two answers were, I don't believe you. In different. The first one was because of illegal immigration. I still think it's 33%, which would be absurd in practice. And then the second one was, I just don't believe you. You're just making
it up. Fake news.
Yeah, fake news, exactly. We probably didn't have that term at the time, but it's kind of that's what people were thinking. Same sort of thing. So they were the top two answers. It wasn't. We gave them options like the media, but it was. They went straight to, I don't believe you. I still hold on to this, and that's where you're absolutely right. Where we've got strong identity-driven views, it really is hard for people to let go of, and that has kind of I still find the cognitive dissonance theories from the 50s, 60s incredibly useful in that, which is, it causes people psychological pain to see things, hear things that conflict with their already held views, and it takes a lot for people to shift. So that's where you get confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias, where people are trying to only find things that confirm their already held views and denigrate anything else. That's a kind of key theme.
Do you have an opinion on the backfire effect? Because I used to talk about this all the time, and then recent studies show it's not replicable.
Yeah, that's a great series of experiments. I know Jason Riefler, Brendan Nye very well, and they are what they found in the end from both that and then the replication that they and others have done is that yes, it's not generally replicable, and that is a really, really important lesson, because I had a lot of discussions with policymakers, campaigners, politicians at the time of that, but it got a lot of attention, and the unfortunate conclusion was that a lot of people that are in quite key positions started to think, okay, God, that means facts and correcting things doesn't work at all with people. And that, in the end, looks like that's not the conclusion. That it does. You can get backfire effects on the most highly emotive issues, the things that are really embedded in people's psyche, things like abortion in the US, those types of issues, or weapons of mass destruction, but not generalized across all issues. So I think it's a really important message, the really vital message to get out there for people who are making decisions on how we use information, that this is not a uniform effect, and facts and correcting misperceptions is not useless, or even worse than useless and negative on reinforcing wrong views. So I think it's a good arc that we've been through on that. The trouble is whether everyone has updated their view to the kind of current knowledge of it, I'm not sure. I think I still see people mentioning backfire effects as you've seen this paper now. I can't use data or facts or corrections for people.
Yeah, I think it also depends very much on how the conversation is going. If you're talking to a climate denier, an example I like to use if you're talking to a creationist, and if you give them a choice between Darwin and Jesus, they're going to pick Jesus. You have to reframe it such that you don't have to give up your religion. Just look at these facts about genetics or the fossil record or whatever, and you can keep your religion. They're more likely then to accept the facts.
Absolutely. I mean, your work on that has been incredibly useful about how do you actually get into those conversations with people. And this is not about upending people's entire worldview. This is about starting a conversation with them with the right frame and then moving on from there. And I see that. I do a lot of deliberative events, as we call it. So it's like town hall events and citizens' assemblies, those types of things in the UK. And you can see how you can get people in the right frame for those types of discussions. And when you do, you don't have the types of fractious, identity-driven only discussions with people that you kind of would see, and we sort of generalize from social media from. That is not representative of how people normally interact with people, even on contentious issues.
Yeah, I find if I say, well, I was once a creationist and now I accept evolution, it's like, what happened? I took a course in evolutionary biology. Or more recently when, I'll say something like, well, I used to be a climate skeptic, but I'm a big free market guy, but I changed my mind because the facts are there. And it kind of opens the door like, wait, you're a free market guy? I go, yeah. Oh, and you accept the science of, yeah. Huh. Okay. Or like the other day, I was doing a debate with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a big Christian conservative here in America, and he's a big climate skeptic. He said the whole thing is bullshit. Well, so he asked me about this before we were about to go on, and I said, well, I'm really pretty much where Bjorn Lomborg is, because I know he loves Bjorn Lomborg. And Bjorn Lomborg says, I think climate change, global warming is real and human-caused, and we should do something about it, and then he modifies it based on, what we should be spending money on, and so on. And he's called a lukewarmer for that. So I go, so I guess I'm a lukewarmer. And then Dinesh is like, oh, okay. All right. So even though I've just told him I accept climate change is real and human caused, but because I put his guy in there, Bjorn Lomborg, who conservatives like, because he's always writing in the Wall Street Journal, and they think he's on our side. But really, he says climate change is real and human caused. Okay. So I can kind of swing it over a little bit that way. It's a very tribal.
It is. There is an identity element to it. I mean, we did a question on what kills most people in the US. Is it guns, knives, or other violence? And the answer, as you probably guessed, is guns. By some distance, it's like 68% of all interpersonal violent deaths are by guns in the US. Second only to Mexico, where it's 76% of all interpersonal violent deaths. This is not including suicides. And the average answer across the US is 59% correctly say guns. So it's not bad, not great, I would think, and given the coverage of guns. But you can see the reason when you look at how it breaks down between Democrat and Republican supporters. So strong Democrats, people who strongly identify as Democrats, 83% of them say it's guns. Only 27% of strong Republicans think it's guns. So you've got You've got the same social reality seen entirely differently depending on your pre-existing political views. And that's kind of a powerful indication of how strong these identity-driven things change our views of reality, and how we kind of meld those two things together into our identity.
Yeah, I did a debate this summer at Freedom Fest, big libertarian conference in Las Vegas, and I was doing a gun debate. And so I, to my opponent and the audience, I said, well, so 40,000 people, 35 to 40,000 people die every year by guns, accidents, suicides, and homicides. If it was 400,000, would you be concerned? Nope. We want our guns. It's like, if it was 4 million, nope, we want our guns. It's like, wow. Okay. But although I followed up with that, if it was 40,000 a year by terrorism, conservatives, they would cancel the Constitution, declare martial law, and spend $1 trillion in homeland security and defense.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's deeply embedded. It's an identity-driven thing on all sides. It's like all of these things. We got our own debates here, obviously in the UK with Remain and Leave,
right,
Brexit,
right,
and people who want to remain in the EU. And it's kind of what we found really in the kind of broader research is that there's not massive difference in lots of issues, on views of lots of issues between the groups, but there's this massive identity-driven dislike for the other side, which is not based on much more than a couple of issues. And we don't have the same polarization that you have in the US, where it's all kind of conglomerated around political identity. But we're getting there. We're trying to get there using our Brexit identity as a kind of proxy for your party identity. And it's that's the scary thing. You can see these identities growing, and then things will come into it, and then views get very set, worldviews get very set. That's a scary trend.
Was there anything to that meme after the Leave vote that the most searched word string was "What is Brexit," or was that just a bullshit meme?
No, I think that is true. I'm not sure it was Brexit, but there was lots of Googling of the EU itself and what does all this mean. And that's it. So we've had some really depressing trends here. Where on the misperception side, where we asked right before the vote, we asked a series of questions about what is the impact of Europe on Britain and what is our impact on them. So things like, there was a famous claim here that we send £350 million per week to the EU, side of a bus that actually Boris Johnson stood in front of and discussed. And that was labelled twice in the UK by the UK Statistics Authority as a misuse of statistics. But they kept using it as a thing. So it's a misuse of statistics. And about 4 in 10 believed it going into the election. And then we repeated it in November last year. So this is, after 2 years of, 2 and a bit years of discussion, and exactly the same 40% of people still believed it, even though it had been debunked and talked about. People just kept believing it. And with the same pattern of Remain versus Leave, Leave is much more likely to believe it. And it's the same on the impact of immigration, same sort of pattern. We went 2.5 years by that point. Now we're in 3.5 years nearly. And no one had particularly moved their views at all on the facts, on the actual issues, because it's such an identity-driven subject. It's kind of impossible to get cut through into those types of things, because it's not really what it's about in the end. It's about a broader sense of cultural identity that kind of, again, not in a dissimilar way to the US.
Yeah.
This is much broader than the apparent issue at hand. It's about everything. It's about how our identity works.
For my American listeners, what is the identity you're talking about? Is it being English versus being European?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because it's not well defined here. We haven't had the long-term focus on, if you imagine you've got a left-right spectrum, which is quite straightforward, economic left-right spectrum, and then you've got another spectrum, another axis that goes up and down, which is, liberal to authoritarian, or, open to closed, or whatever you kind of want to call that spectrum. We haven't had much focus on that here, because we've been very dominated by two economic focused parties. You have conservatives, economically liberal, Labour more socialist, and its kind of outlook. And that's kind of dominated. So we're still trying to work out what this other axis is really in Britain and what does it mean. But Brexit has given it a form. So to answer your question, it's much more about cultural change than about a subnational identity. It's about a feeling that Britain is changing too fast versus people that are comfortable with that cultural change. again, echoes from the US in terms of that, and mainland Europe. A lot of similar kind of themes of it's not really economically driven. It is a bit about people who've been left behind, as they call it here. People have not made progress, but the real driver is much more cultural. It's much more the country does. I don't recognize this country or where it's going anymore. So very strong feelings of nostalgia for the past, that for the people that want to leave the EU. Well, that's one of the things that comes out very high in driving that type of vote. And very obviously a big focus on immigration and the extent to which the population is changing too fast for people's comfort. So they're the kind of key things. It's a cultural change concern, really.
Amazing what 20 miles of an ocean barrier will do after centuries of that kind of isolation or whatever. Wasn't one of the plaints that, why should some bureaucrat in Brussels tell us what we can charge for a dozen eggs?
Yeah. So there's there is definitely a theme about sovereignty and kind of Britain's self-determination. It's kind of, that's a very strong feeling here, the sense of sovereignty. And it was, some brilliant misconceptions and playing with people's perceptions in the campaign around bananas were the key thing.
Bananas, right.
Eggs, in the end, it was whether the EU was legislating for how curvy or straight our bananas.
Right. That's right.
Which was, I actually had to research the directives from the European Commission on this as part of the book, and I never thought my career would end in looking at banana
curviness.
Banana curviness regulation. And there's some truth in that. But it wasn't in the way it was presented. So you can't have malformed bananas because they don't pack well into transport them, and then people won't buy them because they're a weird shape. But it turned it into, by Boris Johnson, who's great at creating these stories yes, they are. And the implication was not really about the bananas. It was slightly, but the implication was, if they're messing around with our high potassium yellow fruit, what else are they getting involved in that they shouldn't be getting involved in, or they don't need to be involved in? And that was kind of quite effective with people. And again, the reality is that every country would have to have a regulation on that. We'll have to have one if we leave the EU. I'm sure the US has similar regulations on these sorts of things. You just have to have them. But it's because it's been attached to the EU and then made into something bigger. It makes it feel like we've lost control. We need to take back control. That was the big slogan.
Do you see any of these identity issues in any of the other European continental members of the EU, or have they adapted pretty well over the last half century?
No. Sure, there is a massive concern in many countries about the extent to which similar kinds of trends are emerging or have emerged in all the big countries, all the countries in different sorts of ways. And it's kind of, we did some, particularly around immigration attitudes and sense of control of immigration. Did some sessions in Berlin a few years ago where it seemed like actually you've got a much more open, sorted, organized view of immigration and integration than we have. And then refugee crisis happened, and actually immigration has been, and other issues have been, a key driver in the rise of populist parties in Germany. And if you look at the charts of populist parties, both left and right, in mainland Europe, it's just stepping up. And so you're up to like a quarter of the vote now that can be put down to populist parties. So it's absolutely a big issue in mainland Europe. It's less tied up, obviously, with European Union membership as such, because it's kind of different sort of context. But definitely on a national level, very, very similar. With the Gilets jaunes in France, with the XD in Germany, Sweden, similar. So you've got all these countries that are building similar kind of feelings of there's something that a bigger and growing population are feeling uncomfortable about.
Yeah. Since Angela Merkel opened the borders up to these Syrian refugees, I presume that the misperception of how many illegal immigrants are coming into Europe has probably gone up.
The trends are interesting actually because they don't shift massively, which is interesting. They do go up a bit, down a bit, but not massively. It's kind of a very similar pattern. It was one of the questions that you're trying to deal with in the book is our misperceptions are actually fairly stable on things like that, where you haven't got where it's not on the back of a big terrorist attack or something. If you ask about terrorist deaths on the back of a bigger attack, then that's. But no, it doesn't actually massively shift around, which points to a couple of the effects in there, really, is that the emotional innumeracy point, which is one of the key ones, which, emotional innumeracy basically says it's we overestimate what we worry about as much as worrying about what we overestimate. So cause and effect go in both directions. So immigration has been a worry for a long time for lots of the countries. So that kind of relationship, that dual relationship between those two things, is not doesn't shift around so much because there is a background underlying worry about immigration that drives that misperception. And it kind of one of the interesting things, it came from the US actually, because I kind of as part of the book looking at the political ignorance, the rational ignorance literature that the US has all the way back to the 1940s and 50s was really interesting because they asked a couple of these types of questions on things like unemployment levels all the way back to 1940s US. And people were just as wrong back then, massively overestimating.
Really?
Yeah, just as wrong. It was almost identical, sort of like 30. People think it was 35% unemployment, which is pretty similar to what the US think right now, 32 or something. When it was about 7% then, and so I think it's lower now, isn't it?
It's like 3.5%, 4%. It's all-time low. But just before Trump won, he was it's like 35%.
Exactly. He was. People were closer to Trump than reality.
By the way, parenthetically, do not let Trump hear about that meme about you can see the Great Wall of China from space, because he's going to want his wall to be even more visible from space.
Yes, I can imagine. Keep that away from. You've got enough on your hands over there without that.
But like your fellow countryman Douglas Murray wrote this book, The Strange Death of Europe, and his new book, The Madness of Crowds. And conservatives like him, it's not just blind immigration anxiety; it's people coming in that do not have or share Western values. That's what we're concerned about. Of course, they're talking about Muslims that do not believe in, say, the equal treatment of women or free speech or the openness to the LGBT community. So their concerns there seem legitimate to a certain extent, but are they exaggerating that kind of immigration that's really happening?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm reading The Madness of the Crowds now, actually, so I'm nearly finished it. It raises some important issues, and then there's some questionable kind of analysis, I think, but it's a good challenge on some of the issues. I think on the perceptions of this, yes, people are massively wrong. So in the US, around 1% population are Muslim. The guess is 17% of population are Muslim, which is insane. And then we asked, and this one is an interesting one because Pew Research Center do some projections on populations around the world, and they did a Muslim population projection. They did quite a short-term one as well as long-term ones, and they did one for like 5 years ahead of the survey, so 4 or 5 years on from the survey. And when we asked people that, it went up to a quarter of the population. So you went from 17 to about a quarter of the population. People are not just seeing it as big, but as increasing massively over time, where the real figures from Pew says it goes from 1% to 1.1%, which is still a big growth in population terms. It says, that is a 10% growth over that period is not normal. It's not like run of the mill. It's kind of, that's quite a big, but it's nothing like a quarter of the population. So in France, it was people guessed that 4 in 10 French people would be Muslim by 5 years from now. So that sense of fear of change and misperception of the pace of change is a key aspect of this. So yes, I agree. There is legitimate concerns. Again, a lot of my background is in immigration attitudes and integration attitudes. So definitely, I've been measuring for years and raising the issue that actually that people are not comfortable with this, and we need to be watching it and trying to ameliorate it as much as possible. But the sense of change is out of all proportion to the actual level of change that people have in their heads.
Well, so your research is really important because people vote based on what they believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question about, yes, what do people vote on? The kind of the emotional elements of voting, the identity elements of voting, as opposed to issue by issue view of things. I mean, I kind of particularly now the identity element to it is very strong, which is interesting because I'm doing a new book on generational differences.
Oh, interesting.
What's actually different between the generations. And one of the few things that is truly generational is attachment to political parties. Generational in the sense that you've got a pre-war generation, or you would call them silent generation, that were about 60% of them attached to a political party, now have been all their life, so on average 60%. Right. So they've got a party. And it drops down in Britain to about 50% of baby boomers. Then there's a big drop to Gen X of about 30% of Gen X say they've got a party, and it stayed the same throughout their life. They haven't particularly changed on that. Then it goes down again to millennials to about 20%, with Gen Z coming in about 15 now, but it's a bit early to measure that. So you've got this incredible, within a 40, 50-year period, you've got this incredible shift where parties could count on the loyalty of the bulk of the population in some way, that they did have this kind of base connection to them. And now it's much less the case in lots of countries. It's a bit different in the US because you've got quite a strong two-party system. It's the same sort of trend, but less pronounced. But in Britain, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, lots of these countries, same pattern over and over again, where we're going to have a much more fluid future, where people are not, you can't count on the votes. These big blocks don't exist, driven by trade unions or religion or things. That's gone. So we've got much more fluid future where identity-driven appeals to people, the more emotional connection rather than a structural connection through religion or a trade union, become much more important. Selling yourself tends to be emotional as well as about the product benefits. So that emotional connection is very, very important.
Are millennials and Gen Z voting as much? In other words, are their votes still up for grabs? You just don't know which way they're going, or are they just not voting at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because the trends in turnout are down, but not down as much as people think. What you find is, the book's going to be called The Generation Myth because it's kind of the things that are called generational, which aren't really. So there is a big life cycle element to this where the young have always voted less than older people. There's kind of there's a sort of displacement effect of there's a lot going on in your life when you're young and you're kind of finding your identity, and you kind of settle down into it more. But people are settling down into it, so they're starting at lower levels and are increasing at the previous generation, but are increasing as they age. And they probably won't reach quite the levels in most countries as previous generations, but it's not as bad as people think. It's when people take a slice through an age group and just say this means millennials or Gen Z are disengaged from politics or whatever. It's just very ahistorical and doesn't take account of you took the slice through Gen X and baby boomers at a previous point in time, you'd see the same sorts of patterns, and it kind of corrects to some degree over time. In the UK, there's a bit more of a generational decline, but it's not nearly as much as people make out. And it's one of the misperceptions in the book is people massively underestimate how many people vote, which is a real it's a real tragedy in some ways because people think it's more unusual than it is. People will guess in the UK that only around half of people vote when it's more like 66% or closer to 70% sometimes now. So that's important because if norms are important, our perceptions of norms are important.
You worry about pluralistic ignorance kicking in and people thinking, well, if no one else is voting, I'm not going to bother.
Exactly that. So pluralistic ignorance is a big threat in this. And so that was a really interesting one, that people need to know that it's normal to vote, and that if we lose that sense, then that kind of reinforcement from norms and us very much following the herd on norms works against us. Which is not good in those types of things.
There's some hashtag going around now about boomers. I forget what it is. Hashtag what is it?
Okay, boomer.
Okay, boomer. Yeah, and that, I think it was Obama that triggered that when he called out the call out culture and the cancel culture, and it was like, if Obama is out of it, there's no hope for me.
I thought the same. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm dealing with that Obama speech a bit in the book, because it's very important what he's saying, I think, and I think the boomer versus millennials versus Gen Z thing is a really interesting one, and particularly in the US, lots of books about the conflict between the generations. When the reality is there isn't much conflict between the generations in many ways. It's because we don't live in generations; we live in families. So we have parents, grandparents, we have children, grandchildren. And they're the people that we are concerned about. They're very important. So it's kind of this sense of that there's a generational conflict doesn't really work like that. And I think more than that is kind of people think that people who have paid in and contributed and done the hard work should be looked after in their old age. The resentment of older people is not what you would expect from the OK Boomer hashtag. That's a minor trend, minor meme that will disappear again in a time, because the reality is actually we care up and down the generational spectrum, both directions, care up and down it quite a lot. But it's a fascinating area of perceptions, misperception.
Have you formed an opinion about this? Gen Zs as the coddled generation. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book that Coddling the American Mind, and then Gene Twangy's book, iGen. It isn't clear to me on the data whether it's so much social media, too much screen time, or because they were raised in a coddled way, or if any of this is even true. Apparently the data shows higher rates of anxiety, like 3 times higher for girls, twice as high for boys, more suicidal ideation, depression. But is that, are those really solid data, or what do you know about any of that?
That is a great question, and that's the bit I'm looking at now. And it is so my conclusion currently is that two very separate arguments in some ways. For the Coddling American Mind, great book. It's much more about the cancel culture and the kind of the elite, what's going on in elite universities with a particular subset of the population who are very active in those types of cancel culture or safetyism kind of debates. And that's an important trend. And so the question is that a generalized trend following that, or are we talking about a niche activity that won't really, as someone who works in a university for the first time now, it's not what I see as the day-to-day experience of most university students. They're kind of getting on with things because they have to in many ways. But equally, and a very important trend to raise, to keep an eye on about how does that actually translate then. Because I'm mostly interested in generational things, and I think the very important thing that Twenye identified is the delayed adulthood thing that we have. We certainly got a delayed adulthood element to it, where things are happening later to people, which, Andrew Scott and others who wrote The 100-Year Life would argue that that's kind of a reaction to our massively increased longevity. If you're going to live, 50% of kids born now will live to 100 years. So if you've got that length of time, you don't rush. You kind of take a slow life course. So there's an element of actually these kids are growing up slower, and then they're taking some of that exploration or need for safety in a university environment rather than in a different environment, which may have happened more in the past, as well as cultural changes. So I think there's an element there. My worry is generalizing from it to whole populations, and then from my perspective, does it actually color a whole cohort of people? that's not what I'm seeing, particularly in the data. I'm seeing it's like a niche thing that we important to recognise, may set a tone for other types of things, but then you're not going to turn into the workforce and bring those types of things with you quite so much as you think. The second thing about the social media impact, impossible to unpick the causal effects related to that. There just isn't the data, but I have sympathy with the gene. I have disagreements on how characterizing a whole generation around a few adjectives and as materialistic, or these are the iGen sort of impact. That's the sorts of thing that gives generational research a bit of a reputational issue, because it's not as clear cut as that. These are slow, smooth moving things, and whether someone's on Snapchat or another platform doesn't really have that much of an impact. It's kind of the sort of technological focus. We can get too caught up in thinking this is new and this is the first time we've technological leap forward and this is going to change everyone. And I don't. But there is something definitely in the data on the prevalence of serious mental disorders among young women and girls.
Yeah.
That is the bit that looks solid, because the trouble with lots of it is the mismatch or the difference between diagnosis levels and prevalence levels. Really important, because diagnosis capabilities have changed, as in people are more open about it.
Yeah.
So the prevalence measures are more useful for looking at. So that's actually measured directly among the population, according to indicators. That's the bit where I've seen in the data, there has been a jump of a few percentage points among women and girls, specifically young women and girls specifically. And I then do have sympathy then with what has changed you can't prove a causal relationship, but what has changed over that period of time. The social media use is extraordinary among that younger generation. It is extraordinary. You've got 90% using it every day.
Right. Hours a day.
Hours a day for a long period of time. And all of that thing about, yes, social media can be a beneficial thing to young people. Lots of data on that. If it's in the right proportion, doing the right sorts of things, how that then displaces other activities that are also health giving, like sleep and exercise, all of those types of things, I think are a reasonable cause for concern.
Yeah, one of my conservative friends was complaining about this, the delay of the iGeners, and I pointed out, well, they're also delaying having sex and drinking and taking drugs. Isn't that what you want?
Absolutely. They are doing that. It's a very, very different view. It's incredible. I mean, one of the stats in this is UK data, but it's 35% of the pre-war generation here, so silent generation, drink 5 days or more a week, and have for like the last decade.
Yeah.
And then it goes down to about 25% of baby boomers, and keeps going down, and now it's 2% of Gen Z, and like 5% of millennials who drink. So that kind of drinking culture is disappearing. That is very solid data over a long period of time, and utterly changed lifestyle-wise. Which is, again, a big proper generational change.
The other misperception amongst conservatives, I think, is this campus craziness that they think is going on, because they're not on college campuses. And if you only watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News, where he has his weekly campus craziness example, they're all true, they really did happen, where Ben Shapiro gets protested or whatever, and you get all these student activists. But, I've been on college campuses every semester for 35 years, and you pretty much never see any of this going on. It's just mostly students just walking around doing their thing, holed up in their dorms, reading and doing their homework, whatever. So to what extent is this really a crisis, or is it just that it's escalated because of social media and it gets immediate attention, sometimes recorded in real time? You could watch the Starbucks burning at UC Berkeley when Ben Shapiro showed up, or no, it was Milo Yiannopoulos. And it just looks like, with the availability heuristic, this is going on all campuses all the time. What has happened to our youth, and so on?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's an element of that, definitely. I mean, I think there are data that Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues groups like at Heterodox and Fire, people like that, have collected on the number of cancellations over time, and they have gone up. But you're still talking about a tiny minority. So at King's College London, where I am, we put on thousands of events last year. And the number that were cancelled or were withdrawn or there was significant protest at is like 0.04%.
Right.
So it happened, and I remember them well because they were very attention-grabbing things, but they were incredibly rare. And that's kind of, again, a very common cause of our misperceptions of things is that vivid, unusual example really sticks within our heads, and that creates a sense of a greater scale than the reality.
Yeah, I mean, this conservative thing about free speech is gone, and, we have to meet in secret or whatever. This is a dog whistle. I mean, most of these guys have huge audiences, big platforms. They get their books published. They have their own TV shows. Their speech is not really being squelched. It's just these few examples that are extreme.
Yeah. I mean, it's an effective sales technique as much as
totally. Ben Shapiro does these talks over here for the Young Americans Foundation. It's a kind of college Republican type group, and they flyer the campuses, and the flyers are very clickbaity. I mean, they're like snowflakes, run and hide in your dorm because Ben Shapiro's coming tonight. Oh my God. And of course he gets a huge audience, and there's always 6 or 7 people in the back screaming or whatever, and they kick him out. But pretty much everybody there loves Ben Shapiro, and and he's begging people to come to the mic that disagree with him. And pretty much every person, oh, Ben, I've watched every one of your videos. You changed my life. And he's like, yeah. Is there anybody who disagrees with me, please? Because this is what we need for a good show.
Yeah, what's going to go viral from this? We need something. Yeah, that's the issue. We do have a different information environment, which promotes different behaviors in order to promote yourself. It is. I mean, like I'm in the book, I kind of talk about system of delusion because, I mean, I think there's loads of great books that look at our social biases, and lots of great analysis that looks at our social bias, our biases and heuristics, all those things that we get from. And there's great books that look at how we have a post-truth kind of culture or environment now, and it's like, and the truth is, one feeds the other in this system, and it's kind of we get the media that we want to some degree because it works, and now we have instant feedback on what works and what doesn't, and that sets a feedback loop of these things going round and round, and that's it's much more instant now, and much more powerful in terms of knowing what sells or what gets clicks. So that pushes it towards all the great work loads of people have done on how angry, highly emotional tweets or any sorts of messages or videos just move much faster than anything else, and it's those things that we're drawn to. And so we've got this systemic issue. It's not about correct our own biases and heuristics, and then we will have a perfect view of the world. It's not about we need to control the media or politicians better. It's systemic. This is a perfect system that maintains itself because we're all human, and we kind of fall for those things and want those things, even though we don't know it. So that's the challenge. That's the challenge, how systemic it is.
Yeah, our cover story of Skeptic this issue is with Steve Pinker, and he did the cover story. Are we living in a post-truth world? Well, he ended up stating is just we're not living in a post-truth world. And the opening of the story is the statement we're living in a post-truth world true? The moment you open your mouth, you've lost the argument because you're making an argument.
Yeah.
And same thing with free speech. It's like, do we have free speech? If the moment you answer, yes, you have free speech. You just spoke. So it's sort of degrees of that. Yeah. I mean, again, just one final point on that. My student, most of them are not snowflakes. Most of them are strong, healthy kids. And, we're just talking about a tiny, a fraction that we're worried about here. But let's talk about one of your fun subjects, because we're still on chapter 1 here, I think. Your chapter 2 on sex. When I was reading that chapter, I remembered a funny anecdote. When I was married in the 90s, one of my colleagues came in. He was a single guy on a Monday morning. How was your weekend? He goes, I finally had one of those weekends that you married guys think we single guys have every weekend. That always stuck with me. It's like, yeah, that is what I thought. I thought this guy was getting laid every night and different women, and oh boy. And, he goes, that's just not the way it was.
Yeah, that's definitely our perception.
So how much sex do we have, and how much do we lie about it, men and women?
Yeah, so let's start with the question that we asked people, because it was we just asked very simply what percent, how often in a month do young people aged 18 to 29 have sex? So how often do you have sex a month if you're in your 18 to 29 kind of age range? And we asked separately for men and women, people to guess for men and women. And so the reality is 4 to 5 times in a month is kind of varies across different countries slightly, but not massively. It's kind of settles down into about once a week is kind of and more or less the same across men and women in terms of frequency, which is not always the case on men and women's views of sex. It's men massively over-egg their number of partners, and women massively deflate their number of partners, lifetime level partners. So there is gender differences there. But it's about 4 or 5 times a month young people have sex. But the average guess is 17 times a month that young people are having sex. And then the average guess for young women is 22 times a month. From men about young women.
Right.
And then the average guess of young men for young women is 32 times a month. So
every day.
Month, one special day where you have twice. So incredible overestimation of frequency of sex. And it's kind of, the two potential explanations of this in that sort of model that I have of, it's either how we think or what we're told. Neither of them are very good explanations. They're neither very sort of positive explanations, because it's either that the media and entertainment culture portrays a view of young people, and in particular young women, that is so sexualized that we have this view of them that they are always out there having sex. Or if you go to the kind of how we think type of explanations, it's either that men have such a distorted view of young women, and sort of that's kind of terrible incel type, they're all having sex and I'm not kind of view of them, because they know how often they've had sex, and they've got this view that everyone else is getting it and they're not. And it's kind of, and again, systemic issue. It'll be both of those things interacting, but it's not a very encouraging image that we have of each other, and particularly men of women in this. So it's kind of it's a worrying one. It's a worrying one that in the context of lots of issues that we've had about sexual politics between men and women. So there's kind of, it's a lot of lies, a lot of exaggeration in sex. When you ask about sex generally, so you have to be careful about how you interpret these types of findings, because people are not utterly honest about them. But that's why asking these perceptions questions gets a good idea of what's in your head. That's the idea. It's like, what is your image of this? And it's not a great image when you get in people's heads on sex.
Yeah. Well, the old number where men had twice as many sexual partners as women, or whatever it was, it led to the question, well, who are they having all that sex with? Unless some of the women are doubling up or whatever. But you solved that problem just by sort of tricking the women into thinking they're being watched, or a fake lie detector, and then their numbers went up, and the men's number came down with your other manipulations, and so it's pretty close.
Yeah, that's right. So it's great work by a whole series of sexual behavior researchers in the UK, and David Spiegelhalter, a great academic on risk and behavior, in his book on sex, went through kind of all these types of things, and as much as anything, part of it is men's very poor estimation. It was actually, we got this view that men are kind of manipulating it for a image management point of view. Is actually they're terrible at estimating things that are not kind of socially mediated behaviors as well. So we've just got an element of a different different estimation approaches between the sexes, all different kind of explanations for it. But there's a social element, social image element to it, but there's lots of other things going on and why people are so wrong.
Yeah, interesting. So, well, the incel thing, yeah, that's an example of real world consequences. If these guys are acting out in an aggressive way against women or other men, or joining ISIS or whatever because they think everybody's getting more than they are, then that is a concern.
Yeah. Yeah, no, these lots of our misperceptions have consequences across all sorts of aspects of our lives. I mean, there's a very few things that we underestimate, which are things like obesity levels and overweightness. And that's kind of like, so in America, 66% of the population are overweight or obese, but the estimate's around 50%. So we're underestimating the level of the challenge that we have for that. And again, that's kind of like
that surprised me. That and diabetes.
Yeah, diabetes. Yeah. But then we overestimate diabetes. So we think, we've heard of diabetes, think it's a risk, think it's growing, then it is a really big issue in many, many ways, but it's not nearly as big as people think. It's kind of one of those things that our attention is drawn to. But the trouble with the underestimating of those types of things is we don't act on it as much as we should. We think that it's actually as big a problem as it is. We don't engage with it. We normalize it when we shouldn't be.
Another one of these hot button issues that you addressed was income inequality. And that seems to be escalating in as we approach the 2020 election here, with the Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, highlighting how much those other people get that you don't get in a very zero-sum way. So talk about a little bit of our distortions about how much money other people make versus what they really make. Yeah.
So we ask people how much do the top 1%, so the focus on the 1% versus the 99.
Yeah.
And it's very unequal in the US. The 1% is a very generally economically unequal society.
Yeah.
And the 1% is very high in the US. So 37%, I think, of the total wealth is owned by that 1%, which is incredibly high for a nation. But Americans think it's higher than that. So this is another example of an emotional issue. This is an emotional reaction. We know that the 1% are ridiculously wealthy, or that the very top are ridiculously wealthy. Probably the 0.1% or the 0.01% are ridiculously wealthy. And we generalize from that and inflate that figure in our heads into a much bigger number than it actually is. And I use these sorts of questions quite often to get an underlying view of what people are really worried about or angry about or have an emotional reaction to. So the bigger the overestimation of these types of things is a good indicator of where people are very worried or not worried enough, like with obesity. But with wealth, there's clearly a big issue and a big concern about inequality in the US. similar to Britain as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is driven by what I call folk economics. That is, our evolved psychology is not adjusted for those levels of wealth at all. I mean, hunter-gatherers are relatively poor. They just don't have much stuff. You can't have much income inequality if you don't have much income, if nobody has much. So, that kind of zero-sum sense we have of products and wealth, it is real in terms of our ancestry. That is, it was a zero-sum game for most of human history. And people that got really wealthy historically, they probably mostly did it through immoral or illegal means. So there's sort of a good reason why we're skeptical of that. Even though if I have to walk myself through it, I shouldn't care how much more Elon Musk makes than I make, because he's not taking anything from me. But that's not how it feels. It just feels like that's just too much.
Yeah. And there's a very strong political element. We're going through a general election now, and it has become a discussion about the extent to which the mere existence of billionaires is an indication of a market failure.
Yeah.
They really, millionaires, fine. You can't having tens of millions, fine. But billionaires is another level of concentration of wealth, and something has gone wrong there. That's the argument, is something has gone wrong there on how that market is structured in order for one person to control that. I mean, that's the Labour Party line on this, is it's putting it out there to people as this is a structural problem with markets, which is, again, it's not something that has been under much debate until recently. We updated some long-term trends for the generational book on preferencing for capitalist versus socialist society, and there has been a big fall in support for capitalist societies over the kind of 30-year period in Britain. Not a big rise in support for socialists. People are like, oh God, the idea of socialist society doesn't seem particularly great either.
So where are they going?
We're going into don't know right now. I think we've got this problem of people can't envisage a system that quite works now, and there is not particularly enamored by socialism with all the connotations that's got, but can see from their perspective, many people's perspective, that it's this capitalist approach doesn't work as it is. So what is the alternative? And I don't think we have one right now. And I think that's what people are searching for all over the place, but not very successfully.
Yeah, my friend John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods, which he just sold to Amazon, he has what he calls conscious capitalism. He's trying to talk his fellow CEO capitalists into moderating their own companies and their own system from the bottom up before the government does it from the top down. And what he means by conscious capitalism is that you take care of all the stakeholders, as he calls them. So it's not just your stockholders and investors, but your employees, the people in the neighborhood where the store is located, the immediate physical environment, the air, the water, and so on. And then you just expand the moral sphere out from there. And he proposes capping CEO pay at 19 times more than the average worker's pay, instead of 300 or 400 or 6,000 or whatever it is for Jeff Bezos. And he's trying to talk people into changing their attitudes about capitalism, because I think of this shifting attitudes toward it that's so negative.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I've had an interesting discussion around the generational differences and myths, is the extent to which there isn't a big generational push for more conscious capitalism or more social responsibility or whatever, social license, the different terms. It's not really driven by generation. You haven't got this coming generational push. It's across the spectrum in many ways. It's not. It's always been the case that we always think it's the young people that are pushing for it when it isn't really. So it does make you think that actually it's a lot of the pressure is coming from the business side on that more socially responsible. It's them themselves. And you do think of Paul Polman at Unilever and others like that are can almost be market makers in a different form of capitalism. So coming from it as more a business-driven response of responsibility rather than a huge clamor from the public, because I can't see massive generational shifts in people demanding this. But when it comes, people recognize it and like it. So I can see this, again, quite systemic issue of you do need people like the guy you were talking about to actually push that, because it's not going to come on its own from the other side, and we could go in a more dangerous, different direction if we don't get improvement in that.
Yeah, that's right. So, and again, there's this availability heuristic keeps coming up. There's what we see. We see the billionaires. We see the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates. There's the model. You drop out of college, you move back to your parents' home, you start a startup in the garage, and you get to be a billionaire. So yeah. I've talked to some of my venture capitalist friends about this who walk me through it. It's like, well, we hear 100 pitches, we fund one. And out of the 100 that we fund, one becomes an IPO or gets bought up by Google, and the guy makes, $400 million in one day. Well, what about the other 999? Well, they're gone. They moved back home with their parents, and they're still living there. We just don't see that. Yeah, it's those
availability and all those vivid stories that we love. We love storytelling animals is true, and we love that story. There's not much interest in the 99, the failure of the 99 doesn't make an interesting story very much.
I call it the biography bias. There's no biographies of all the guys that started internet or computer companies in the 70s that failed, because I don't even know who they are. Who cares?
Yeah, exactly.
And as I tell my students, don't drop out of college and move back to your parents' house thinking this is the way to go. Or be a real asshole like Jobs and yell at your employees. It's probably not a good model. Yeah. So let's just hit a couple final points before, because I want to be mindful of your time. Talking about some of the other sort of hot button issues. The anti-vaccination movement is incredibly still alive. I just can't believe it after all the debunking that we did of the Wakefield paper and all the doctors that have promoted vaccines and so on. It still has a toehold.
It's a tragedy. Yeah, it's incredible. So we asked people around the world, 40 countries, I think this was, whether they think there's a link between vaccines and autism in healthy children. And the incredible thing was that around the world, it's still 4 in 10 people think there either is or that they're unsure about it. So you've got this incredible, and that splits more or less half and half. So you've still got 20% of people who think that's definitely true, that there is a link between these things. So 1 in 5. And it's kind of, it is affecting behavior. We can see that it affects behavior. And we're getting outbreaks in the UK. We're getting outbreaks. The tragic thing is it stays with people throughout their lives, because you've got this little cohort of people coming through. So we get in the UK, we get warnings at music festivals because the 20-year-olds that were when the Wakefield kind of scare came through and missed their vaccinations are now mixing with other young people at music festivals or university or whatever. So you've got this a cohort effect of measles outbreaks or warnings about measles outbreaks in a county called Essex in a festival that they were putting on. And you just think, God, this has long-term repercussions that just keep coming back. And you see it in Italy where it's been politicized. You see it in all sorts of countries now, including the US, obviously. And yes, it won't die. It won't completely go away. And I was surprised how prevalent it was.
Yeah, this is one of those ones that made me think the backfire effect was real. It's like the fact that this is still hanging on. There, the power of anecdotes. I'll never forget that on National Autism Day, Larry King Live had on his show, he has this like long table that sort of curves. So on one side, he's got one set of experts, a couple people from the CDC, a couple eggheads explaining all the data and statistics about vaccines. On the other side, he had Jim Carrey and his wife at the time. What's her name? The anti-vaxxer. What's it?
Was it Jenny McCarthy?
Yeah, Jenny McCarthy. Yeah. So you could see who was winning this one. You got the propeller heads talking numbers, and you got the attractive celebrities talking the anecdotes. She has an autistic kid, so pictures of her little girl and so on. And it's like, oh my God, this is the whole problem of human psychology playing out in one episode.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. I mean, it's kind of, I think it's Paul Offit that's got that great line about every story has a victim, a hero, and a villain. And in this case, Jenny McCarthy's son is the victim, she's the hero, and that only leaves one role for him.
Right.
So he doesn't appear on those sorts of things. So it's kind of like, yes, those stories stick, unfortunately.
Yeah. And finally, let's talk about the coming election and the hacking of Facebook and social media by Russians or whoever. When that story first broke, and everybody was concerned about it, and they still are, I still kind of in the back of my mind think, but I'm free to choose. I don't have to read those stories. I mean, the implication is almost like we're, Skinnerian rats pressing the bar, in this deterministic way. You don't have to go on Facebook, and if they send you articles about Hillary and the Pizzagate thing, you don't have to believe it. Aren't people volitional beings?
Yeah, they are to some degree, absolutely, of course. And it is, you don't want to, all of the kind of claims of Cambridge Analytica that they affected the result in this massive way, there's people that are skeptical about the actual impact of those types of actions that were quite close to the inside and said, actually, this wasn't nearly this idea of laser precision targeted ads and communications that's just getting people to do what we want is a bit overblown in terms of people. But it does set a tone, and it does it's that kind of illusory truth bias point of you keep seeing these things, and some of it seeps in, unfortunately. So I think there is an issue. And then I think, the issue that politicians are increasingly talked about, which we talked about a while back, is it's not really one thing now. I see it as three things that come together that are some of the big threats for us, which around political campaigns and the role of digital media. Is the three things are the kind of Cambridge Analytica ability to micro-target people because they know a lot about individuals. That combined with the sort of the completely new capabilities to use AI, use artificial intelligence to iterate messages in, the examples from the US of 100,000 iterations of the communication in a day, because you can kind of change very small tweaks about what one works, and you get a very quick evolution of what messages work. And then the third element is the deep fake element to it, potentially. Which the deep fake element is obviously these videos that you can you can actually just make it look like someone actually speaking these words, and you type in the words and get them to say whatever you like. And this is not deep fake from a kind of fake news point of view. This is deep fake on, if you imagine you have someone who's controlling, it's on Donald Trump or the other candidate's campaign team, who is controlling the words that Donald Trump says with his permission. So this is part of the campaign. This is not sort of subterfuge. And then you've got AI that can iterate that about which of these messages work best. And then you've got micro-targeting. That means that Donald Trump or the other candidate can be saying something different to you to what he's saying to me, and I will never know what he's saying to you, and you'll never know what he's saying to me.
Right.
You've got a combination here of, put all those things together, you've got a combination here of what you're completely losing what Habermas and others would call the commons of we understand in political spheres what politicians to some degree are offering. We all have the same understanding of what we're being communicated to about. And that's the scary bit. And it's those sorts of, those kind of leaps forward in our electoral campaigning communication laws, certainly in the UK, have not kept up with the capabilities of the technology. And we're miles and miles behind. Going into in an election now, we've still got the same old laws, no controls really over that type of thing.
I mean, these elections are so close, you don't really have to snow that many people. Just a tiny fraction, just to nudge the needle a tiny bit.
That's right. That's correct. And it's the broader principle of what is democracy about. And if we all got our own individually tailored messages, that's not democracy. That's that's a terrible version of it. That means that we don't know what we're getting. We won't know what we're getting. And that's all of those types of things, and it's sort of crazy. It's crazy when you think about it. And the trouble, the sort of final element of that trouble is that's only what we know about now. And the trouble is we will legislate if we ever get round to it, which is, we're too late for us for this election. You legislate against that threat, and then there'll be something else that we haven't even thought of yet. And the problem is the technology accelerating faster than the regulations and legislation can control. And that's the real crux of the issue, is the speed of change in this communications environment that we are so far behind, and we will never catch up with. And it's those aspects are the worrying aspects.
Yeah, I'm a boomer, and I still read a physical newspaper every morning with my coffee, and then I go out for a bike ride, or I take my dog for a walk, and then I play with my kid. And by the time I log on to social media, I'm so far behind. I mean, like 4 or 5 hours of not checking your social media. It's just, who knows what direction it goes. It's like, that's incredible.
Incredible.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, I mean, sort of the last large issue of democracy and moral progress and so on. I like to think that we've been heading in the direction of, sort of open borders and transportation and mass communications and seeing other people as just another honorary member of my tribe, my family, my community, and so on. But the rise of populism in the last couple of years has, kind of concerned me a bit. Like this is, that sort of tribal instinct. It's just right below the surface. It could pop right back up at any time.
Yeah, and you can see that in the misperceptions work, is it's there, the base is there in terms of those identities, and it's actually probably more related to the generational book in the sense of, I'm a big fan of Ron Inglehart and Pippa Norris's look at culture. How does culture evolve over time in a generational basis? And it goes slowly because it's you are socialized into a particular culture, and it's very important in those early years that late teens, early 20s, you kind of got a cultural outlook. It does shift over time, but less so as you get older. And it's so that's why things change slowly. They tend to kind of evolve rather than have sudden shocks. But as Pippa and Ron warn, it's not unidirectional. We have had this movement of everything has gone from is moving in the direction of, we had a very kind of security-based value system, and now it's been moving towards more self-expression values of, it is more open because we've sorted out the basics of life. And but they've detected slips back in people's, as soon as you get those kind of sense of threat, right, you do emphasize those security values rather than those self-expression values. And I think that is, socializing generations of people into a more, a less stable feeling environment, so that they focus more on those security elements. That's the worry, is you embed that quite young in people, and then it kind of flows through slowly at a generational pace. So this can go on for a long time, rather than we've got a crisis of democracy now and we'll sort it and then it'll be fine. Doesn't really work like that. So you can see like we're on the tail of at the tail end of a kind of run of that more liberal general direction, and where it goes now, we've seen a bit of an inflection point where it could slip back.
I'd be interested to see what you come up with in your Generations book on the rise of the nuns. 25% of all Americans, 33% of millennials, probably 40% at least of iGeners. Now, of course, my atheist friends like Dawkins and Sam Harris and so on are like, yes. And it's like, but hang on, they're not necessarily atheists. They're not joining the Skeptics Society. Maybe they're going to Deepak Chopra and the Western Buddhism movement or the New Age movement, or they're filling it with something. It may not be nothing like atheism.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a couple of quick thoughts on that. Is, first of all, there's a great kind of religious researchers here, academic researchers here, who talk about the move from a kind of a conscript to a professional army by religion. So we kind of all had a cultural connection. We had to go, really, and you didn't have much choice, really. And now you're getting down to the professionals. It's the professional army because of cultural pressure. It's not quite there anymore. So their argument is, actually, what does that mean for the health of religion? Does that mean that religious health is actually going down? Because it's actually, you've got a more committed professional army that's better than a load of conscripts who are reluctantly going along with this. So there is an element of that to some degree. And then, but second, your other point about, I've got these brilliant charts on the extent to which Americans pray every day, and the spirituality is a very strong spiritual country. That even with that rise of the nuns, there's still big sections of majorities of millennials and Gen Z who say they pray every day. It's not gone to a godless, utterly non-spiritual society overnight. So there's a very, very strong element of spirituality in the US that we don't particularly have so much here. A very Anglican kind of. That's much more about coffee mornings and cake sales, rather than the spirituality of it.
Bowling leagues, or whatever the equivalent of that'll be for iGeners. In atheist, skeptics, humanist circles, the debate is, do we need to replace religion with something? So, secular humanists, they have, churches you can go to, essentially, wedding ceremonies, funerals, babysitting. But basically, they want to provide everything religion provides, but through secular institutions.
Yeah, people will always want that connection. Human thing.
Yeah. So, well, Bobby, we've been going for almost an hour and a half, so I want to be mindful of your time. The book is really a fun read, but super interesting, packed with data. I love that. When's the Generations book due?
So it's next year. This time next year.
Yeah.
So
but again, with the pace of change about what people care about, it'll be interesting to see if in a few years, immigration, AI, whatever is going to still be at the forefront, or if it's going to shift to some other concerns.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know this more than anyone, Michael. This sense that it's always our era that is seen as the most speedy, technologically advancing one. When you can find brilliant quotes from every era in history that says, "God, we're the unique era where technology is leapt forward in unprecedented ways," and it's kind of is that sense of actually, yes, it always feels like that. And I do think where I come out in the end is, these underlying patterns, these human patterns of generations and life cycles actually can withstand an awful lot of change. And we just keep plodding on through our life cycles, millennials included, Gen Z included. They will keep plodding on, and they may do it a bit differently.
Yeah.
They may do it a bit later, but they'll end up following not a dissimilar path in many ways.
Pinker's got I think it's a lecture, maybe it's one of his books, but where he opens up with complaints about kids these days, essentially.
Yeah.
And they don't write like they used to. Their grammar and their speaking abilities and their manners and so on. And it turns out it's like somebody from Harvard in the 18th century complaining about the kids. Like, oh,
we've got lots of those. We've got lots of those in the book. Plato through to the Middle Ages. You've got everyone complaining about kids.
That's too funny. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And again, why we're wrong about nearly everything, a theory of human misunderstanding. Great read. Bobby, thanks for being on the show.
No, thank you, Michael.
You have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.